Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the release of Unrealized Gains, Opportunity Zones in Small Businesses. My name is Jerry Mincer. I'm the Deputy Director of the Economic Development Team at Smart Growth America. I want to go ahead and thank our panel for joining us today, and a special thank you to our research team at Smart Growth America and at the Democracy at Work Institute, as well as generous support from Citi. Please, throughout the broadcast, please share any questions in the chat box. We'll be answering them at the end of the webinar. So this research set out to measure the impact of opportunity zones on minority-owned legacy businesses. A lot of our findings were that the investments really weren't reaching businesses due to a variety of barriers and challenges. And we worked to understand those challenges and develop recommendations for reshaping and tweaking the incentives to help improve and accomplish its goals. So we're going to hear from Citi, from SGA, and from Dowie to walk through some of our findings and our recommendations on today's webinar. Before we do that, we want to hear a little bit about you. So we're going to launch a poll that asks what your connection to opportunity zones is. And it's just a multiple choice poll that you'll see on your screen in a moment. And give us just one more moment as we launch the poll. We're going to go ahead and come back to our poll after we hear from our first speaker, Tina Correa, who is the Vice President of Citi's Community Investing and Development Group. Tina?
Thank you, Jerry, for the kind introduction and for inviting me today. It's been great to collaborate with you, Calvin Gladney, Christopher Zimmerman, as well as other leaders at Smart Growth America and the Democracy at Work Institute, or Dowie, teams on this project, including Zen Tram Tranholm, who you will also hear from shortly. As mentioned, my name is Tina Correa, and I'm a VP with Citi's Community Investing and Development Group on the U.S. Business Partnerships team. We work across Citi business lines to develop solutions that enable the bank, its clients, and partners to expand access to financial services and advance economic progress. Our team collaboratively determined with Smart Growth America more than a year ago that taking a look at opportunity zones, given the potential for the incentive to impact the fabric of communities and the small business market writ large, would be important since we've invested in strategies to further economic development that is equitable across the country. So much has changed since the beginning of this research. I don't need to tell this audience, but in large part due to the many pressing issues of this year and devastation that so many communities have experienced, disproportionately so communities of color and lower income communities. The project team faced challenges to their original research plans, yet pivoted and I think reached important conclusions that the research experts from SGA and Dowie are going to share very soon. You may be wondering how Citi Community Investing and Development became part of this project. Although this report is being released today, our team at Citi has prioritized taking a racial lens in our community partnerships, starting in asset building with our support to build and preserve ownership among communities of color. For example, the Asset Building Policy Network, of which Citi has been the sole corporate member for more than a decade, chiefly utilizes a race lens to inform programs and public policies impacting low-income communities of color, including the racial wealth gap and anti-displacement of small businesses in neighborhoods and communities. This focus on preserving legacy businesses that anchor local wealth and jobs, as well as provide access to critical goods and services, led our team and nonprofit partners to engage in a national multi-year effort aimed at preserving Black-owned or operated small businesses, as well as other businesses owned by people of color. Beginning in 2013, we invested in capital access, research, and other strategies in this regard, capacity building as well. And since the advent of COVID-19 in the US, we have also added resources to these efforts to help support crisis management for businesses in transition around the country during these very difficult times. Perhaps most recently, I'm excited to share that last month, as an institution, Citi launched Action for Racial Equity, which represents an unprecedented effort to leverage cities' core business capabilities to intentionally move the needle in addressing racial equity in the US. City global economists also invested in taking a deep dive look at the impact and cost of racial inequality in their GPS report, which stated that if the US had closed key racial gaps for Black Americans in wages, housing, education, and investment 20 years ago, $16 trillion could have been added to the US economy. If these gaps are closed today, $5 trillion could be added to US GDP over the next 5 years. I think the report underscores what many of us already knew, which is that achieving racial equity isn't a zero-sum game, it's pro-economic growth benefiting us all. And I think it also shows that the private sector does have a role to play. To conclude, we believe that preserving existing business assets, especially when taking a racial lens, can be transformative and result in changing the narrative and the reality of how our economy is structured. That said, we welcome today's conversation and all of the discussants' respective commitments to building this new paradigm. I appreciated the chance to be with you today and look forward to the discussion about how investing in legacy businesses can really move the needle for economic growth. And let me offer my thanks again to the Smart Growth America team for inviting me to participate in this important dialogue, and especially for their leadership and authorship of the report, along with our longstanding partner in related small business preservation work, Dowie. With that, let me turn it back to you, Jerry, to continue the dialogue.
Thanks very much, Tina. I'd like to introduce Calvin Gladney, the President and CEO of Smart Growth America.
Good afternoon, everyone. And it's just awesome to do this panel so you guys get to see all of my great team members and some of my favorite non-SGA people, including Tina. And Zen and I share a sartorial belief in how we should roll, as well as his great research abilities. So these are some of my fave folks. So you get to meet us and see us all in person. This moment is super interesting. If you look at the challenges of the pandemic, the challenges of hits to small business profits, and frankly, the pivots in politics, which may occur over the coming months. And I just wanted to hit you with a couple of statistics which make this really an important time to come out with a report that talks about how Black and brown businesses have suffered challenges currently, and how the idea that, and I don't want to give away too much for the report, that the opportunity zones tax incentive may not have been the backdrop or support that we thought. Three things: 41%, 66%, and 95%. 41% of all Black businesses closed by May of this year and didn't reopen. And that's from a study by the New York Fed. That's 41% compared to only 17% of white businesses. 66%. 66% of all Black businesses are in counties that have the highest rates of COVID-19 infection. So this is not just the fact that they're having challenges, they're in the place that are having challenges specifically because of the pandemic. And then finally, 95%. 95% of Black businesses did not get the benefit of the PPP program that was supposed to backstop small businesses. So you really take those percentages and you see that this was a moment where understanding whether the opportunity zone tax incentive really actually lived up to its goals, its intents, and frankly, its theory that you could take a tax incentive and it would create a market-based approach to getting capital to small businesses, and particularly Black and brown businesses and low and moderate income businesses. It's a great time for this report to come out to assess whether that intent, whether those goals have been met. And I'm just really proud of the team and everyone else for the work they've done, and look forward to sharing with you what we've learned and what we're going to recommend going forward.
Thanks, Calvin. Next up, we'll hear from Zen Tram Tranholm from Dowie.
That's right. Hi, folks. And again, thank you so much, Calvin, Jerry, and the rest of the SGA team for pulling this all together and working with Dowie to examine what's happening in our cities and figuring out how we can support our minority-owned legacy businesses. So again, a big thank you to Tina for continuing to support this work in communities across the country. So I'm really glad to be here today and to share a little bit more about some of the stuff that we learned with you all, and to really be part of a conversation moving forward, but how we can, what we can do, better, basically. So just a little bit of background. So I'm with the Democracy at Work Institute. We were founded by the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives to expand employee ownership to reach communities most directly impacted by social and economic injustice, including workers of color, recent immigrants, women, and low-wage workforces. And for those on the call who are encountering the term employee ownership for the first time, it simply means a business that is owned and controlled by the people who work in it. At its core, right, employee ownership means workers have both financial equity in the business that gives them real risk and reward, and a structural ability to voice their desires and create the working conditions that meet their needs. And so I manage our Shared Equity and Economic Development Fellowship Program at the Democracy at Work Institute in partnership with the National League of Cities, where I support cities across the country to develop employee ownership initiatives that meet the needs of their communities. And what we learned in working with cities, specifically with cities in our program, but also with cities all around the country that are similar to them, is that with cities that had growing economies, cities were contending with displacement pressures that were pushing communities out. That meant a loss of local ownership. That also meant rising poverty. And then with cities struggling to generate growth, the focus has been on how to attract, or in many cases develop local industries, connect workers to those jobs, but importantly, not lose those companies to other cities, states, or even other countries, right? And all cities, as Tina mentioned a little earlier, are facing a widening racial wealth gap, a persistent capital gap for entrepreneurs and business owners of color, and a growing small business succession crisis as baby boomers retire and seek to exit their businesses. And again, all of these issues continue to be exacerbated by COVID. And so, amidst these overlapping crises, right, the United States is looking at the loss of many of its small businesses. And so business owners are going to be forced into choices that will likely devastate local economies. Either some of them may be able to sell to larger corporate competitors or private equity that will consolidate and downsize. But for those owners, for many owners, that may not be an option. So they may choose to retire instead and close their businesses for lack of a buyer. And so these transitions of locally owned small, medium businesses will likely result in large-scale job loss, a decrease in local ownership, and growth in economic inequality. And at Democracy at Work Institute, we help preserve locally owned legacy businesses by supporting small business owners to sell to who's often their best, and in many cases, their only buyer, which are their employees. So, our cities now are struggling to meet community needs with severe budgetary constraints. So we need thoughtful and innovative approaches to overcome the exponential effects of the interplay among the wealth gap, the credit gap, and the small business succession crisis. And so, we joined Smart Growth America on this research project in the hope that opportunity zones can be one of the capital interventions that can be used to retain small businesses and the critical services, goods, and jobs they provide.
Thanks very much, Zen. Before Vicki introduces our research, we're going to just briefly show you the results of our poll to give you a sense of who is listening into this webinar and what their connection is to opportunity zones. So can we launch those poll results, please? There we go. So we've got an interesting mix, a lot from the municipal side and a lot from general interest, as well as a good representation from real estate, as well as a few business owners and some who are on the investing side. So thanks very much for sharing that with us. And from here, I'm going to introduce Victoria Finibi, who is with Smart Growth America, to talk about our research that we conducted.
Thanks, Jerry. So in our research, as Calvin and Zen really well, we sought to understand the ways in which opportunity zone investments may or may not be supporting the economic stability of small businesses. So we wanted to know if the opportunity zone tax incentive was achieving its goal of place-based economic development in distressed communities, and if not, what was causing this from happening. So earlier this year, we began by conducting interviews with a number of individuals who would have some level of regular interaction with opportunity zones. And this included municipal staff in the economic development or planning departments, OZ fund managers, as well as small business owners located in opportunity zones. And then to build a greater nuance, we just take place with representatives from all over the country. But we focused on 4 core cities, and those were Atlanta, Georgia, Washington, D.C., Louisville, Kentucky, and Miami, Florida. So these were 4 cities in different regions of the United States with varying levels of OZ investment activity. And coupled with the interviews, the team collected data on businesses and economic trends, specifically those in the 4 cities, but also nationally. However, I do want to highlight that all of the information that we have, or at least the data that we have, predates the pandemic and specifically includes data from 2018 and therefore does not reflect the full effects of the pandemic on the economy. However, as we moved further along in our research, it became clear that the consequences of the pandemic would be extremely relevant to our work. And as businesses are struggling to operate during this time, OZs could serve as a path towards recovery.
Great, thank you.
Oh, sorry.
No worries. Thanks, Vicki, for setting me up.
Slide. Sure, thanks. So for each individual that was contacted and subsequently interviewed by SGA or a DOWI staff member, we worked to understand the following questions. First, are opportunity zone funds investing money in the right places? So in the 2 years that the tax incentive has been operating, how have communities benefited from the incentive? Second, what investments are being made? How are they impacting the commercial space and existing businesses? So as I've stated, this is a study of opportunity zone investment trends. So is there a dominant investment product type? Is there a split between commercial, multi-use, and residential? And further, what are the measurable impacts of these investments in the greater community? And lastly, how can opportunity zones support minority-owned legacy businesses? So as the incentive stands, in what ways can the opportunity zone tax incentive be of use to longstanding businesses? So these were the questions that were critical to our research and led us on a very interesting path of discovery that will be highlighted in our findings, which now Zen will further discuss.
Perfect. Thank you, Vicki. Great. I think I might still be getting an echo though. Okay. Oh, perfect. I think that's all good. So yeah, I think those research questions were quite pointed, but I think there was also kind of a second layer question that we're asking, all the actors kind of doing this work in the different cities. And what we tried to figure out was what was the interplay among cities, businesses, opportunity funds in particular, to, I think, kind of figure out exactly how investments are being made and in what projects, just to get a better sense again about different priorities and whether those priorities aligned, competed, or just kind of passed each other. And so, as we were interviewing, the different cities, we were thinking about, how were municipal staff and economic development or planning departments who provide local oversight on opportunity zones engaging with opportunity zone fund managers who have focused their fundraising and projects in the city, and how did all of that connect to small business owners in particular opportunity zones? And so in essence, we want to understand the degree of coordination, right, between investors and cities, and small business owners were part of the conversation and ultimately the recipients of investment. And so our interviews with each actor revolved on, the investments, how are they being made, with what projects, and what impact has that had on local economies. And so as we tried to think about how work is being done now, we also we asked each of our interviewees to think with us about what was the obstacle, maybe the possible solution to directing investments to particular minority businesses. So I'm going to actually pass it over to Becca to lead us through some of the very specific findings in our interviews with each actor.
All right, thank you, Zen. So one of the first things that actually became apparent as we were conducting our interviews was that a large proportion of these investments were actually being made primarily to real estate development. Within that too, we found that a lot of these projects were at least partially included multifamily developments. So in our report, we detail a number of factors that have contributed to this trend. However, primary among these includes some key components of the tax incentive regulations that are much more conducive to real estate investments, which already had a broker environment in place to support such deals. Numerous fund managers that we spoke to as well, who are currently involved in OZ real estate investments, explained to us that it was a natural progression for them to incorporate OZ incentive money into the types of projects they were already involved in. They explained that the incentive simply served as an added bonus to the types of projects they were already doing, rather than changing investor interests or even the types of projects they were involved in. On the business side, in line with that, we found that the regulations have been easily adapted to these real estate projects. However, this has not been the case for businesses, by and large, especially for existing small and minority legacy businesses. One of the first things that became apparent among this group is that multiple business owners relayed the challenge related to relinquishing equity rather than dealing in debt. Many were very hesitant to relinquish ownership to qualify for the investment, and emphasized also the need for technical assistance, training to become more competitive by means of things like harnessing technology or understanding the financial opportunities available to them and having the social capital to make use of those. So one thing that became especially clear in that was also an understanding that there was a real lack of understanding among the business owners of how the incentive could be harnessed by them, what the qualifications were to become a QOZB, and what benefits would even be available to them if they did so. The design of the incentive, as I've already stated, makes it especially difficult for existing businesses within OZs to qualify. Though it's relatively easier for startups and businesses moving almost completely into an OZ, this isn't the case for existing businesses within OZs. This is related to the gross income and tangible property requirements, which are detailed in the OZ regulations, and which qualify these OZ businesses to receive investments. So while a number of the businesses we talked to already did know about the incentive and had put themselves on the city portals, they did not believe it to be a worthwhile pursuit because the benefits simply didn't outweigh the costs of attracting investors and remaining compliant with all of the regulations. On that line, we also talked to different municipal actors. So among the cities that we interviewed, engagement varied from city to city. Some used things like matchmaking portals where investors, prospective projects, or businesses could get in touch with one another. Others published OZ prospectus, and still more hosted events where they invited startups or existing businesses or project organizers to come meet with potential investors. We learned that city involvement is very important in shaping the OZ landscape within a city, but there are still some key limitations on what they're able to influence. Another thing that we saw as we were looking at this is, well, if a lot of the money isn't going directly to businesses, what is happening and what are those impacts? So one of the things that we saw is that investors rarely have a sole motivation to garner positive social impact. This doesn't mean that it's not among one of their interests, but it rarely changed the tide of the work that they're doing. So while these added tax incentives are of interest to investors, it has also reportedly not caused a shift in investor decision-making in the types of projects or in the magnitude of the returns they're expecting to see. They are generally seeking larger and more predictable investment opportunities as well, which oftentimes businesses don't represent. In line with the impacts then of what we're looking at, as I already stated, some of these cities are utilizing portals. However, the information listed on these portals, there is room for the cities to list or for the projects to list the intended impacts they're going to have, but there's no guarantee or way to track this impact as there's no standardized reporting guidelines. Given that investments are primarily going to real estate investments, The majority of business owners we spoke to also explained that it's nearly impossible to know the impact of these OZ projects, even if they are happening around them. This is because you have to be very involved with the environment, with investors, which the real estate development environment, there's a lot of involvement there. However, among business owners, they stated that, there's no yard signs going out in front of new development saying how it's funded. So even if they see changes happening, it's difficult to attribute those to the OZ incentive. And they also, no one that we talked to really relayed a change in rising rents yet. However, they did relay the worry that that would be something that could come if the same type of investments that are happening continue to happen without any kind of guarantee that the community is involved. Additionally, from what they do know and understand from the side of the businesses, the people who are making these projects work, the investors and often fund managers, don't live in the communities and they aren't anchored there. And so therefore, there is a sort of mismatch in the understanding they have about the needs of these areas, the projects that they're doing, and the actual impact and effect it has on the people there. So with that, I'm going to hand off to Jerry and Calvin to talk about some of the recommendations that we took going from here.
Thanks, Becca. Before we dive into recommendations, Zen's going to talk a little bit about what we heard, what was needed from businesses.
Yeah, thank you so much, Becca and Jerry. I'll keep this brief because I'm excited to talk about the recommendations. But it's clear, right, in these findings that existing businesses and opportunity zones are just generally not benefiting from the incentive. And so, again, in answering the question about how opportunity zones can better support minority-owned legacy businesses, our interviewees pointed to several challenges posed by both the legislation itself, but also how it's being implemented in particular places. So from a business owner perspective, right, we know owners need capital to grow their businesses. We know that employees hoping to buy their workplaces from retiring owners will need capital in order to do so. And we also know that equity investments will work for some, but that many do not want to surrender ownership, right, as has come through our interviews. And so, what's needed now, right, is capital that is aligned with both business needs and community interests. And the way it's currently being, the way the legislation currently allows for investments to be made and how those are coordinated and connected to particular projects, there leaves a lot of room for improvement there. And so in addition, we also know that the ability for business to even connect to opportunity funds is limited. So, even before COVID, I saw that in responses poll that we have a lot of folks from different cities. So you may agree with this here as well that cities have sometimes very, very limited capacity and resources to connect with their longstanding businesses. Oftentimes, these legacy businesses been around for a while, but they kind of are not on the immediate radar all the time. A lot of cities don't have registries for their small businesses that can track whether a business is longstanding or not, and be able to then target support. And so that's a tall order. It's a big lift to be able to identify these businesses and connect to them. But that's extremely important if we're talking about equitably targeting impact. And that does mean identifying who these businesses are, what their needs are, and figuring out how we can make sure they can access appropriate capital. So what's needed is a more active and empowered broker role that can connect investors and business owners around these community priorities. And so, in essence, while the legislation itself needs to be revised to better align the vision with its impact, cities, opportunity funds, and their ecosystem partners also have some opportunities to strengthen the support infrastructure for business owners to connect to these investment opportunities. Now, I'll just end with this. We are facing a long economic recovery, and as we look ahead, we're going to need all the tools in the toolbox working in alignment to ensure that we don't repeat the mistakes of the last recession. So I'm going to pass it now to Calvin and Jerry to share our recommendations for how opportunity zones can be deployed to support an equitable economic recovery.
Thanks very much. And thanks again to the research team for walking us through all of those findings and the takeaways that we found through this process. So we've divided our recommendations into sort of three sections. I'm going to cover the first one, which is specifically about the legislation that enabled that created the tax incentive. So the first big one, and this is something that Becca mentioned, is allowing investments to be made in the form of debt. This would allow investments to be made without businesses giving up control of their business and equity in their business. And it also expands the types of businesses that could benefit from OZ investment. Along with that is a suggestion to change the tangible asset requirements for some existing businesses. So those requirements currently hinder businesses from accessing investments. And going along with that, a way to shift away from those requirements are for businesses that already and exclusively exist in opportunity zones. They should be a qualified opportunity zone business by right. It should happen automatically. It seems like a fairly straightforward fix for the tax incentive. A third area where we see improvement is to streamline legacy business and minority-owned designations. So many cities and other municipalities, states have some sort of recognition of a business being a legacy business or minority-owned. And at the federal level, streamlining those recognitions to qualify at the national level would provide reliable business data and would help municipalities provide targeted education and training on things like opportunity investments, or some of the things that Zen has mentioned, like succession planning, things that Dowie works on. And then finally, another recommendation is to offer a guarantee of the tax benefit for those investments in small businesses. So currently the regulations create a little bit of uncertainty. You don't really know what the tax benefit you're going to receive is until the end of the 10-year period, or at least later down the road. So to incentivize investments in existing businesses, a guaranteed benefit level could be offered to those who invest in minority-owned legacy businesses. So those are some changes to specifically the legislation. And I'm going to hand you over to Calvin to talk a little bit about what we recommend can be done at the state and municipal level, and then also what can be done more generally to align the goals of the tax incentive with the outcomes that we want to see.
You know, to be clear, we are strong believers in the potential and, no pun intended, the opportunity in the opportunity zones tax incentive. But to also be clear, we believe that you need to build supportive infrastructure around the tax incentive if you want to get to the equitable goals that are part and parcel of why it was passed, if you want to create a place and more people who are healthier and get to share in the prosperity that will come post-pandemic, we believe that you have to create supportive infrastructure that not only helps businesses access the capital, but frankly aligns these investments of opportunity zone capital with the community's visions and beliefs in itself. So all of these following recommendations kind of relate to those things. But first, I wanted to mention one other thing that I think is important. Only 7% of all Americans have capital gains. And 66% of those folks make $1 million or more. And that takes me to our second recommendation here, which is to build a bigger table of folks who can benefit from the this tax incentive, as well as the folks that can bring their vision of where these investments should happen to the table. If you're basically saying it's a group of folks who mainly make more than $1 million a year, which means that they more than likely don't live in the opportunity zones themselves, it's hard to think that these type of small businesses in opportunity zones will get those investments. So dream with us for a second. Recommendation number 2 says, give residents and employees the opportunity to be investors. So that means not just folks, not just Americans who have capital gains to be of capital gains that then they can avoid capital gains taxes, which is the basis of the incentive, but to allow residents in those opportunity zones and employees of those particular businesses to invest whatever capital they have and get the benefits. Now we know that's a kind of a radical idea, but it's one that really can get us to a place where more people are at the table, and it starts to help maybe align the capital investments with community visions. Number 3, require investments to reinforce local plans, gets to that same idea. which you'll also see in another recommendation about community benefit. And it's really saying, if the goal is equity and promoting equity and actually preventing inequity, it has to relate to more of the capital investment, has to relate to the community's vision itself and those small businesses' place in it. And then the final couple of recommendations really relate to the fact that city governments, state governments have to be a quarterback for this effort. Going back to my point about supportive infrastructure, I think one of the philosophical ideas of the tax incentive was that you can create this market-based approach and let the market do what it does, and this incentive alone would be enough. And as Becca said earlier, all of the investors and fund managers we talked to essentially said that that tax incentive alone was not going to be enough. The idea of the social gains were not going to be enough. And so we need this supportive infrastructure, these community visions, and these other ways to align capital investments from Opportunity Zone related funds to get to these types of small businesses. So that is, in a way, you can wrap our recommendations. We have 8 of them. There's a lot of more detail in the report, but it really relates to how can we align it to the community's visions? How can we create the supportive infrastructure that these small businesses need to both access the capital and understand how to use it? And finally, how do we support cities and municipalities to be that quarterback and that partner that these small businesses need?
Thanks very much, Calvin. We have one more slide that just shows the rest of the recommendations, and one of them, and Zen, please jump in if you'd like, but it is specifically about encouraging some of these investments towards employee buyouts that you touched on earlier. So I just wanted to give you the opportunity if you wanted to go into any detail about that one.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jerry. So I think if we're thinking about preserving legacy in our communities and ensuring that equity is broadly shared, we know, right, that basically retiring owners are closing shop in record numbers, and that's only being, that's only increasing per year. So we have a major opportunity here to direct investments to save small businesses, preserve local ownership, preserve a tax base, local jobs, ensure those jobs become ownership stakes so that employees are able to build assets that are then locally rooted in those communities. So we're talking about like long-term resiliency of local economies. And the thing is that in order to do this, you're going to need capital coming in. And many employees do not have the capital on hand to buy a business, right? And so what are ways in which we can direct capital that is aligned with these priorities in a way that does support employees to be able to make really a pretty big leap into securing their future? And there's, people ask, well, how might that be possible? It seems like a challenge. Like a lot of businesses right now are transitioning to employee ownership. It requires, support obviously for employees to, develop the training capacity to step into positions of management and governance. But there's technical assistance and support being offered all around the country to do just that. And business owners, worker owners are able to provide that to each other through peer-to-peer support. And so we're seeing cities actually deploy this strategy to again preserve their local economies, and I think the critical kind of the bottleneck here is the ability to deploy capital quickly enough and in a large scale amount to be able to, I think, be able to save the businesses that can be saved at this stage. And so it's very important for us to encourage investments in vehicles that specifically focus on employee buyouts. It costs less to maintain a going concern, and in the long run, that multiplier effect has incredible dividends for your cities. And so Opportunity Zones, again, is one vehicle in which we could direct investments in a way that can promote this particular strategy.
Thanks very much. And this is repeated by several of our comments earlier, and there have been steps in this direction, but one of our recommendations was also to improve the ability to track the outcomes and know what's going on with Opportunity Zones, because as Calvin mentioned, there is great opportunity in them and we want to know what's going on. We want to be able to see those successes and see the results, but it was challenging to track them. We're going to shift over to a Q&A session. So we've gotten a bunch of questions in the chat, one of which I'll start out with. about slides and the report. So the report is out. You can visit our website, smartgrowthamerica.org. And on our resources page, the report is there. You can download it, sign up for our mailing list, and contact us to learn more. And we're going to give folks just a moment to get some questions in. We've gotten a few throughout the presentation, and we will get that started in just a moment. So please send in any additional questions you might have. And some of these are really great questions that the folks on this call would love to follow up with folks on, you know, continue the conversation. So please don't hesitate to reach out to Smart Growth America, to the Democracy at Work Institute with follow-up questions. So one of the questions we've gotten so far is, drumroll please, do you have any evidence of Opportunity Zone investments benefiting small community members, or is it too soon to tell? It's a very good question. I think it actually relates back to one of our recommendations that we need more transparency in what's going on. Calvin, I think you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, you know, I was going to say what you just said. I mean, part of the challenge here is if you think about, again, it's a tax incentive. So the only place that where the money went officially shows is no place. On your tax return, it will just show that you invested the money in the way that you put money into a fund that followed all of the rules. So the IRS itself won't exactly know where that money went. And then it really comes down to, at a state and city level, where could you try to back into figuring out where the source of funds came from and whether there was any public reason for folks to publicize it. So there's a transparency issue to actually know the answer to your question, because we don't know the source of a lot of the funding for projects that did benefit, as you said, small community members. So that's one. The second thing I will say is the other challenge with a market-based approach to all of this is that the markets take time. And markets are biased towards, as you heard from the team, they're biased towards things they already understand. So real estate deals, real estate funds, as Becca mentioned earlier, there are brokers, there's a middleman ecosystem that allows real estate transactions to happen. If you've heard of 1031 tax-free exchanges, it looks somewhat like the tax incentive. So there's a number of ways that real estate investments would work. And so the other challenge is to knowing whether small community members are benefiting is that I would imagine that even if this tax incentive was going to work as designed, it will take longer than we imagined to get there. And then you have the advent of the pandemic coming in the middle of what was already going to be a longer time before you get to businesses. So I think there's a lot of challenge to even knowing, and it was going to take longer than anyone thought anyway.
Thanks, Calvin. I'm going to combine two questions here. How might a local government implement some of that local matchmaking and investing? And then a parallel question is a concern about that quarterbacking, that local government staff often don't have the resources or they're overburdened, especially right now. So partly, how can they do that? And the other side of it is, how can they do it right now? How can they sort of manage that that new responsibility?
Ooh, there's a lot in there. You know, we totally understand, are empathetic to capacity constraints, which sort of always exist and are now have been accelerated and, you know, are worse than ever. One of the things that we've done is to have a sort of train the trainers approach and to say, are there ways to create peer networks of city employees who are working on this, to create a way that there's a sharing of best practices, and so that city staff who don't have the time to learn a new incentive, figure out a new programming approach, can plug into an existing network of folks, maybe rural folks, or plugging into a network of larger towns and cities that are doing this work all the time. And we've been running around the country a series of what we're calling Opportunity Zone Academies, that do just that, that allow other cities to plug into a larger network and build relationships with peers. The other thing I'll say is to leverage the power of the internet, not in the sense of let's just Google the answers, but we've tried to create, and a numbers have created a number of portals that are basically ways to go and get resources that will help you really in a plug and play basis. And one of the things that we would like to do going forward is to try to figure out a toolkit for city leaders to say, here is a basic kind of step-by-step approach to doing these things so that they don't have to learn it up, they don't have to have multiple staff people, and trying to figure out what are the priority things they need to know and do, and just provide that. So those are just a couple of ideas.
The only thing I would add to that, Calvin, and I think this is included in one of the appendices in the report, is oftentimes cities, right, as I mentioned earlier, don't have kind of a sense of the known universe of businesses in particular neighborhoods. And it can be really difficult to be able to access that data, either because there's just no capacity really to be able to do door knocking, be able to proactively track that data, or which is a case I've heard in many cities. Cities sometimes are just unable to be able to either augment their business license applications, be able to collect key data points and be able to use that data to target services. Either because of local challenges, but largely oftentimes through state law. So I get that. That's a huge obstacle. I've seen some cities take some very creative approaches to get around that. One city in particular, I think this is the example in the appendices, is the city of San Francisco, which has since 2015 has really prioritized legacy business preservation. And they created kind of an opt-in registry, which was a way for them to say, okay, how can we make sure we celebrate these legacy businesses in a public way? And in the case of San Francisco, direct resources to both the business as well as landlords to provide a long-term lease to keep the business there. So even if the city is unable to provide those types of subsidies, I think the idea around an opt-in kind of registry might actually work for your city to be able to understand the kind of the universe of potential businesses in your area. Simple way could just be like, we're going to promote your legacy business through some stories, right? We're going to showcase how you've contributed to the community through your goods, your services, just your role in the neighborhood. And we'll promote you on a website, or we'll put a little sticker on your window, what have you. And in that way, you're able to collect information that then will allow you to be able to go back out to and say, hey, look, you're in an opportunity zone. Here may be some ways in which you can access these resources, be it growth, capital to grow, or capital, particularly if you're a retiring owner, to consider selling to your employees.
And I think I'm going to say something controversial because it's the afternoon, sort of wake everybody up. Part of the answer really is that you can't do it all. So you can't save all the businesses in your city during the pandemic. You're not going to be able to direct opportunity zone capital to all the businesses that need it in your community, in your city, in your town, or in your rural area. So you're going to have to say, is there already some strategic priorities in terms of commercial corridors or types of businesses? Maybe you need to work backwards from some equity metrics where you know that to support and promote racial equity, you have specific goals, and therefore you might prioritize your finite resources and capacity to work with those businesses. At some point, you have to basically say, we have some priorities that we have to focus on. It might be, here are the businesses that are in corridors that are subject to potential for gentrification and displacement. So we want to take a particular focus in driving capital and doing the matchmaking for those businesses. But I think the point has to be finite resources, pandemic times, don't try to do it all. Pick some priorities, figure out where you'll get the best bang for your buck if you're successful. And if you do that, you can look back and say, well, at the very least, we achieved some specific goals rather than trying to do a little bit of everything and just doing a lot of nothing.
Thanks, Calvin and Zen. We've got time for about 2 more questions. So the first one is, do we think the results would have been different had we focused on more rural areas? We did focus on 4 case study cities. So would it be different at all had we focused on more rural areas? Why or why not? And I think Becca might have had some thoughts on this, but I'll let anyone else jump in as well.
Becca.
Yeah, so I think this is a really good question because we did focus on 4 cities. And I think there's kind of 2 parts to this answer that relates a lot to the regulations as they are right now. So we did have to dive into the weeds of the regulations to really understand what's allowed, what's not allowed. So one of the things that I think would hold true in rural areas and cities alike is the fact that businesses that are already existing there and operating there are not going to benefit from this incentive because of the regulations related to the tangible assets. And so unless they really don't have any tangible assets, they have no physical either building or materials that they're using, then they're not going to be able to take advantage of this program. The place that it would be different is for businesses relocating into these rural areas. So if the goal of your rural area is to attract more investors, to attract businesses to come set up shop in your town, in your city, then there is a lot more potential for that. And that's what we're kind of seeing now is people, it took a lot longer for the regulations around businesses to even be understood. They released 2 different kind of sets of clarifications on what those were. And after those sets, I mean, you'll see EIG has done some webinars about businesses and opportunity zones. And what they're finding is and like I briefly mentioned, it's better for startups, right? It's better for those who didn't have tangible assets to begin with, or those who are looking to completely relocate and then can qualify. So on that regard, if your rural area is looking to really attract new employment, it could be something that helps, depending on what kind of employment. And obviously there's still a whole bunch of challenges there. But that is something where if your focus is not on existing businesses, there could be more opportunity relatively. Yeah, Robin?
And let me just say 2 quick things. This again gets back to we need to create supportive infrastructure to bolster what is ultimately a market-based tax incentive because of 2 things. And I actually think the potential worse answer that would be to that question is all the results would be worse. 2 market-based reasons. One is the market goes for things it understands. So if most of the funds are literally not located in rural areas, most of the folks who have capital gains who are putting the money in those funds aren't in rural areas, then the market is going to go to places they know. And most of those folks who are the investors and the fund managers don't know those places. Now, we have collaborative partners like Opportunity Alabama and others who are focused, but as a general matter, the market isn't going to understand these places as well. And then secondly, and this is all within our research, investors are still looking for the same returns, and because it's a fund market-based structure, they're often looking for a certain minimum amount of capital that they can put into each business. And in many cases, rural businesses are going to need less capital to be put into their business, and therefore there'll be market-based challenges to find funds that want to make smaller investments in places that they've never been and may not understand. And we think it's fixable, but it needs to be with this supportive infrastructure. The market is not just going to do it itself.
That is a great point, exactly right.
And I think that's a nice segue into what's going to be our last question, which is, are there third-party actors you would suggest or include in terms of realizing community benefits?
Yes and no, I'll say. And folks should join in. I would say no, because one of the things we really need to lift up is the community. You're sort of lost in all of this is ultimately supposed to inure to the benefit of the resident or small business owner in that community. And really the community isn't represented. So, you know, as opposed to a third sector, we need to figure out how to actually lift up and empower, co-power, educate the folks in the community and those small business owners to actually help the market get to them. But then I'll say yes, in that the philanthropic community and great banks like Citibank and others need to say, hey, if we believe, just as Tina talked about earlier, you know, the Action for Racial Equity for Citibank really is focused on how to get funds directly to businesses of this type as a means to racially equitable outcomes. We're going to need third parties with capital, banks, philanthropic organizations, nonprofits, and others to say, okay, this is a market-based tax incentive. Let's put our money to steer the market in the direction that we want, knowing that cities are capacity constrained, knowing that cities are not just generally capacity constrained, but coming out of the pandemic are taking multi-million-dollar budget cuts. So the answer is yes, in the sense that philanthropic, nonprofit, and frankly, other sources of capital need to use that capital to drive to equitable results and add to what the market would otherwise do.
Thanks, Calvin. And I want to close out by saying thank you to all of our participants for joining us. Thank you again to our research team and our panel here today. Citi, Dowie, my colleagues at SGA, this has been a great effort, and we hope you learned something. We hope you enjoyed this webinar. The report is available on our website. Please don't hesitate to contact us through the website to learn more. And take care, everyone. Stay safe and have a great rest of your day. Thanks again.
Go vote.
That's right.